Behold, God's dwelling is with the human race. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will always be with them as their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death or mourning, wailing or pain, for the old order has passed away. The one who sat on the throne said, "Behold, I make all things new. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give a gift from the spring of life-giving water. The victor will inherit these gifts, and I shall be their God, and he will be my son." The word of the Lord.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. God is my shepherd, so nothing shall I want. I rest in the meadows of faithfulness and love. I walk by the quiet waters of peace. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. Gently you raise me and heal my weary soul. You lead me by pathways of
A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. Brothers and sisters, no one lives for oneself, and no one dies for oneself. For if we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. So then, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For this is why Christ died and came to life, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Why then do you judge your brother? Or you, why do you look down on your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, "As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bend before me, and every tongue shall give praise to God. So then each of us shall give an accounting of himself to God." The word of the Lord.
Please stand.
Help those you saved by your blood. Raise them to life with your martyrs. Save your people, Lord, as their brother. Raise them up.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to you, Lord. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. I came to first know Gary coming on 20 years ago, I believe, when I was a seminarian and assigned for an internship, what we call a pastoral year, at St. Anthony Parish in Renton. And in the years that I've been here at Issaquah, I've been grateful to continue to see him regularly. Having said all that, I didn't know Gary the way that you all did. And so I'm particularly grateful for what Sally shared about her father and the things I read about him to kind of fill in, at the very least, the snapshot for me. And I'm very grateful to hear that and understand better this life that we are commending to God. This man who, yes, we could say we're celebrating his life, this man who we miss. You know, it's worth noting, I believe, that Gary died on what the date that this year we celebrated Palm Sunday, the entrance into Holy Week. And it might seem like an arbitrary coincidence, but when I consider kind of all that Palm Sunday means, and maybe even more how it relates to what we are doing right now and on this day, I think it's worth considering. It's on Palm Sunday that we began, it was on Palm Sunday rather, that we began our walk with Jesus towards his death. The readings on that day, they are lengthy, but they kind of lay it all out. That in that last phase of Jesus' life, and that gradual movement towards death. And while in it there's sadness and suffering, experienced not only by Jesus, but certainly those around him. And this is an experience that you all know right now, I have no doubt. But that experience of walking with someone in their last phase of life, walking with them towards death, odd as it might sound, it's somehow a privilege, but it for sure is also a sorrowful burden. Some of those moments are grace-filled, as I can imagine you've already recognized those and will continue to reflect upon them. Some of them are grace-filled, but others, and maybe particularly in the moment, have us wishing we could be anywhere else. There's no getting around it. Death of a loved one comes with a great weight and a sadness. But one might reasonably wonder, why is that so for people of faith? It's a good question. Well, one reason I believe is that we're never entirely ready to let go of the people we love. Even if on some rational level, we know that our loved ones, nor we, will live forever. I find it's true, even if on somehow we feel a certain relief for them, that their suffering is over, that we're still never entirely ready for it. Simply put, even if we can rationalize it on some level, if our minds can understand it, well, our hearts, on the other hand, are never entirely ready to let go. Those exchanges of love that come through looking in their eyes, saying or hearing, I love you. The touch, those exchanges of love, when they never get exhausted, it always leaves us wanting more. That's one of the reasons for the weight we bear upon our hearts. Well, I think another reason is that, yes, even for us of faith, and even if with kind of hints about what comes next for us, they are hints only. And so what comes with death, yes, even for those of us with faith, still remains largely shrouded in mystery or lack of sufficient understanding. You know, even with scientific attempts to explain human life and death, it's still a mystery. And so to give our loved ones over to something that we don't entirely understand, that is, where they are going exactly, where are they right now? Are they okay right now? Well, in whatever ways those questions can't be answered, that troubling uncertainty festers within our hearts. And by the way, maybe I'll comment upon that notion. Sometimes we're inclined as people of faith to say that they're in heaven. The fact is, We know that's where God wants Gary. And I believe that's where Gary wanted to be, at least some part of his heart. But we don't know if he's there yet. Our desire to simply say that, I think, comes from a desire to honor him. But I think part of it comes from wanting to console ourselves, that I can sort of close the book on it. And when in fact, I want to suggest that we consider it this way. Bearing in mind what I already said, that God wanted him in heaven. And I believe I knew Gary well enough to know that some part of him wanted to be in heaven. And so it will be. Our task is to pray for him, to pray him to heaven. And if somehow we seek to console ourselves saying that he's already there, well, then we've told ourselves that we don't need to pray for him then. Let us not make that mistake. Our task is to pray for him. And it's a beautiful and a privileged responsibility. You could say it's one of the ways that we care for our loved ones now that they've crossed over the threshold that is death. You know, I mentioned that Gary's soul left his body on Palm Sunday. But it's also worth noting what Palm Sunday and Holy Week eventually lead us to. It's also worth noting that we are gathered here in this place today on what we call Easter Friday. That is, these 8 days, the octave of Easter. In other words, for us, we stretch out Sunday to a span of 8 days because it's too important to what we believe and where we hang our hope to just simply limit it to last Sunday. In these days that immediately follow Easter, at the Masses we have each day, we continue to hear those readings that recount, yes, the sadness that Jesus' followers initially felt in losing him. And in those accounts, depending on which ones we hear how he would console them, to restore their faith, but also to remind them. Saying, for example, to despondent and saddened disciples after his death, "Oh, how foolish you are. How slow of heart to believe what the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And he said it gently, but to remind them. And so for all the ways that death confounds us, I believe that Jesus would remind us that his resurrection is the cause for our hope. Among the many ways that we can try to understand what Easter means, maybe one way is to say that it is God's response to the human dilemma. You know, among the many, I guess you could call them disordered realities that are born in the effects of our universe and our world and in the lives of humanity, perhaps the gravest or most serious of those is death. That, as I described it already, that separation of the soul and body that God had infused, that were intended to be together. Yes, what we celebrate in these days of Easter, and really right now, what is the cause for our hope is that God provided a solution to our problem. And so bearing that in mind, similarly to how Jesus approached those disciples who, after his resurrection, were still not getting it, still kind of sad, I can imagine him similarly coming to us. Jesus saying, "Do not be slow of heart to believe what I told you, that I was raised from the dead so that Gary could be raised from the dead, that I entered into glory so that Gary could come into glory. Do not be slow to believe." And it's fitting that we're reminding ourselves of this in this place, a church. And for all the ways that we don't do everything well, as a church and me as a pastor, one of the things I love is that you could see this building and everything that we do in it is built upon a pervasive hope. And this place is filled with signs and symbols of hope. That towering Paschal candle, like a pillar of fire standing right up against Gary right now. That light that burns is to remind us of hope. But also that font of water that's like one that Gary would have been baptized in. And in those waters of baptism, the cause for hope lies because that's where he received the first installment of what God has held in store for him. And we hear readings over and over, just like we did in this very Mass, to remind us that in this life, even with all the beauty and joy it brings, it also comes with tribulations, causes for fear, periods of loneliness, emptiness, suffering, uncertainties that trouble our hearts, and yes, even death. But these readings remind us